Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, the dance in Annapolis over slots. House Ways and Means Committee Chair Sheila Hixson sets out the basis for a compromise with the governor. But Delegate Luiz Simmons warns that the lottery has already proven gaming preys on the poor. Poor, homeless, and teenaged. That's the subject of a photo and video exhibit at a D.C. gallery. We'll visit with the artists and Washington Post art critic Blake Gopnik. And we revisit the controversial rave club dance scene for teens in the D.C. area. Author Beverly Lowry drops by to talk about her biography of a pioneering black woman Madam C.J. Walker called Her Dream of Dreams. Plus, the Joanne Juskis Trio returns to wish a friend a solemn happy birthday. And poet Adrian Harjo spins a fairy tale. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. The White House at last has good news to report on the economy. Never mind that jobs were actually lost in the third quarter. There was a big surge in growth during that period. But now that the tax rebate checks have been spent, will that growth be sustained? And even if it is, will it generate enough tax revenue to offset blooming deficits, federal and state? Maryland is about $700 million in the hole for this fiscal year, and experts say that number will only increase over the next few years. Governor Ehrlich proposes balancing the budget with spending cuts and revenue from bringing slot machines to 4 racetracks. But House of Delegates Ways and Means Chairwoman Sheila Hixson says, at best, slots will provide a revenue stream 3 years down the road.
The slots will not do the job alone. This is not. They're certainly a huge, they'll bring in $700 million when they're up and running. If we vote on slots this session, it will be 2 years before the state of Maryland would gain any money or any revenue from this. So what we're saying to the governor, and certainly hoping to negotiate with him, that we need an ongoing revenue source for the 2-year cushion piece before slots even came in.
Hixson notes that a 1-cent rise in the state's relatively modest sales tax would by itself wipe out the $700 million deficit. Or, she proposes, close corporate income and sales tax loopholes. That would pretty much zero out the deficit. But the governor vetoed a bill last session to close corporate tax loopholes, and he's pledged repeatedly not to raise the sales or personal income tax.
When he's saying no to income tax and no to sales tax, then he needs an alternative to offer us. And at that point, we haven't seen it.
But the governor's office is saying, you bring me the alternative, and when you bring me the alternative, I'll tell you what I think about it.
Well, you know, and if that's the negotiations, I'm afraid we're in for a long session, okay?
Or maybe not. The governor is signaling through his press office a new openness to closing certain corporate tax loopholes and to raising certain fees, but he's still staking his reputation and revenue prospects on slots.
If he wants slots and he thinks that's the end all, he can't just have that without giving up something too. In politics, that's the art of the possible. It's negotiations, and also the bottom line is votes. We have the votes. He doesn't.
The governor argues that slots break no new ground, that there already is gambling in Maryland, like horse racing and the state lottery. Polls indicate that a majority of Marylanders favor slots, but an even larger majority wants slots financially controlled by the state, like the lottery. And a recent study by the Maryland Department of Planning is giving some legislators pause about not only slots, but the lottery itself. Luiz Simmons is a Democratic delegate from Rockville. This is his second stint in the House of Delegates. Over 20 years ago, he served in the House then as a Republican. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you very much, Mark.
The Department of Planning study found that the lottery raises a disproportionate share of its revenues from low-income residents of the state. Does that come as a surprise to you?
Well, I requested the study in order to try and move the discussion beyond anecdotes and to quantify the nature and the extent of the money being raised from poor and ill-educated communities. The study, which was the first in 33 years, actually establishes that many, many poor communities, especially communities living at or near the poverty level, spend not thousands, not millions, but hundreds of millions of dollars each year on lottery gambling. These communities are hemorrhaging huge sums of money into this rat hole that we call gambling, instead of retaining the money for their communities for child support, for child care, for nutrition, and for other types of infrastructure programs. So when you say, was I surprised, I have to say that I actually was a little surprised at the magnitude of the expenditures made by poor communities, as well as the association and the coincidence between higher poverty levels and higher expenditures on lottery sales in Maryland.
Are you suggesting that we scrap the lottery or target it more to higher, more affluent communities as well?
Well, first of all, realistically, you could not scrap the lottery. If you asked me in a perfect world, in a platonic world, what would I like? 25 years from now, I would like to see the lottery repealed, but I am not. I'm not going to be unrealistic about this. The purpose of this study, however, was to demonstrate to people like Delegate Hixson that gambling, in fact, as it exists in places like Maryland, does exploit the poor, does exploit our most vulnerable communities, our most fragile individuals and children and their families, and that the introduction of more virulent forms of gambling, like slot machines, and make no mistake about it, these are hypnotic, they are seductive, these are the profit centers of casinos. 80% of casino revenue comes from slots. That the introduction of these activities may cause some of these very poor communities literally to implode, and that we can't ignore what's actually going on in Maryland now with the lottery. And I thought that this would provide some database from which to begin to make some reasonable deductions about what new gambling would do, and I think it does.
It might make those that case, but nonetheless the polls indicate that most Marylanders favor slots, at least they do right now, although they prefer it to be controlled, financially controlled by the state, as opposed to the racetracks or the gambling industry, what have you. And the case is made, it's a libertarian case to be sure, that isn't it better that people get to engage in an activity that they enjoy, gambling, they voluntarily engage in it, as opposed to paying taxes, which nobody voluntarily engages in and most people don't enjoy doing.
Well, two points before I get to your major point, and that is the polls. Up until very recently, a majority of Marylanders oppose slots, and I agree with you that the most recent polls suggest that a majority now supports it. But I've often been reminded that if polls were correct, we would have had President Dukakis. These things do change, and they go up and down. Getting to your point about libertarianism, as I've understood libertarianism over the years, I think a way of looking at it is that I can extend my hand as far as I want as long as it does not come into contact with your nose. That's, however, not what's going to go on with gambling in Maryland. There's a collision here between theory and practice. When many of these communities begin to implode, and there are well-documented studies of the social and economic costs of gambling, the Maryland taxpayer in other communities, whether it's in Pikesville or Rockville or Silver Spring, are going to have to bail out these communities.
Now, there are clearly studies that indicate that there's a higher frequency of domestic violence, certainly more bankruptcies where there's gambling. But Delegate Hixson makes the case that the slots will be less onerous, will burden the poor less than does the lottery. Let's take a look.
If you have a slot, you have to go somewhere to get there. That brings a different dynamic into it. That you can't go to your corner drugstore and do it, and you can't buy it at the grocery store or something to that effect. So we think that keeping it outside of neighborhoods, a person has to have a destination point, and that would be a deterrent.
The only problem with that is that there's no evidence to support that. That's a kind of a nice evasion. The fact of the matter is that study across the country has shown that the poor and the vulnerable are the ones who are the most susceptible to gambling, whether it's at destination. I would point out that many of the very proposals that Delegate Hixson says are on the table would in fact put slots in communities near racetracks or put them in communities near fairgrounds, which are not detached from these communities. The reality, however, is that every major study that has looked at gambling across the country, even those that believe that perhaps there are more benefits than there are disadvantages, admits and acknowledges that the poor, the ill-educated, and those who are least equipped to deal with this type of an activity are the ones who find themselves going to it. So I think we have to be at least honest about it and say, if we're going to have expanded gambling in Maryland, if we're going to introduce these new virulent forms, we are going to be severely impacting upon our poorest citizens, our most vulnerable communities.
Well, let me ask you why. Some people suggest that it's more than a revenue issue, that what's driving this is the gaming industry itself. That the governor is in their pocket, that the Senate Majority Leader Mike Miller's PAC took $225,000 from the gaming industry, is under investigation for that. That Delegate Hixson herself is a beneficiary of large, substantial campaign support from the gaming industry. You introduced legislation in the last session suggesting that candidates, campaigns, politicians cannot take money from the gaming industry. Delegate Hixson says, well, that's fine as long as it's after the gaming is in place, that she doesn't know of any situation in which, before the gaming industry was established in a state, that such a ban on campaign contributions to the gaming industry were enacted. Let's take a look.
But until it happens, it seems that a person still has a right to petition your government. Why they would be singled out as the only industry not to do this. The insurance companies are another. I mean, if we were going to go that route, I think that we'd have to be very circumspect on every industry. I think it's called fairness.
Fairness?
I think it's called acquiescence to organized gambling. The National Gambling Impact Study Commission of the United States Congress did the unprecedented thing of recommending a moratorium on the acceptance of donations from organized gambling to state and local races. I think that it's very, very unfortunate that instead of acting in a proactive way to address what is going to be a tidal wave of political donations from organized gambling, some legislators wish to wait until there are indictments and convictions and a further erosion of public trust before acting.
But very quickly, what is the distinction that you draw between the gaming industry, as it's a legal industry, and the insurance industry or trial lawyers' contributions?
I think the difference is between theory and practice. There are some people like Delegate Hixson who say, look, you have all these special interests. What's the difference with organized gambling? That's like saying that a shark is a fish and a minnow is a fish, and therefore what's the difference between a shark and a minnow? But if you looked at them face to face, you'd understand the difference. The organized gambling has a leprechaun's pot of gold. They can put in millions of dollars at the drop of a hat, have done so, have exercised inordinate influence in the states in which they have been introduced, causing at least two of them, the state of New Jersey and the state of Louisiana, to pass bans on contributions from organized gambling to state and local races.
I gather you're going to try to do the same thing again in the forthcoming session.
I'll try to do it. Delegate Hixson will oppose it, but I do think that we ought to have a vote this year, which Delegate Hixson did not allow last year, and that people should go into the next election at least having had an opportunity to know who's for it and who's against it.
Thanks to Delegate Luiz Simmons for joining us in the coffee house. No doubt slots and the lure of easy money will again dominate the forthcoming legislative session in Annapolis. But lawmakers like Delegate Simmons will do their best to remind their colleagues of the adage that if it sounds too good to be true, well, you best take a second look. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Welcome to the Artistic Eye at the Coffee House. This month, we're looking at an art exhibit called Civic Endurance at Connor Contemporary Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. For this provocative exhibit, two artists from New York teamed up with homeless teens in Seattle. The point was to create art that challenged the homeless teens and also drew attention to their plight. What came out of it were beautiful photographs and a hypnotic video that blend art and social activism.
The work itself is interesting. It comes out of a program called Arts Up that the Seattle Arts Commission funds, and it's the first time that a city Percent for Art program has been able to use that money, which normally goes to brick and mortar and permanent sculpture, but rather they found a way of putting that into a kind of artist process-centered work. And from that, they selected 3 artists to interview. So Jackie and I, about a year and a half ago, went out to Seattle and were interviewed by the very people you see hanging on the walls. So in that sense, it shifts that notion of subject, you know, because in many ways, they selected us rather than us selecting them.
It's almost as you're viewing them, they're witnessing you witness their performance.
I think this kind of exhibition is extremely important in Washington. Washington, for 40 years now, has had a tradition of caring deeply about formal art, about abstraction, about how things look.
And in this case, people tend to look at the politic first and the formal qualities later, but I think that they stand side by side.
What I would argue is that now activism is a major stylistic stream in contemporary art.
We try to create a place where the viewer will really sit with the work and sort of find their way into the meaning, the sort of the deeper narratives through a kind of visual experience and aesthetic experience.
Since the early 60s, activism has become a style and even has a look. For instance, as it were, four-square, kind of almost flat-footed photography is the look of activist art. Video, like this, is also the look of activist art. That is, any art that doesn't look explicitly stylish then has a style which is the style of activist art. That is, it has a kind of anti-style, which soon becomes style.
They are beautiful photographs, and I think one of the things that sort of is a thread that you'll see in common with all of the work that my wife and I do is that we try to create a kind of formal presence.
One of the things that interests me about the political in art, and one of the problems with it, and in fact with content in art in general, and talk about content, is you have to ask yourself, if this art looked different, if they were black and whites, if they were color with a gray background, if they were very harshly and dramatically lit in a kind of sentimental way, would the content be substantially different? That is, what do you do with only talking about what the art is of if it doesn't actually tell you about what the art looks like? And that's a problem for me in criticism, for instance, that tends to only concentrate on what the art is about. Talk that acts as though you're seeing the kids rather than seeing pictures of the kids worries me.
This is not just about homeless youth. It's not just about Seattle. It's about what happens in society.
One of the first things that did strike me about the photographs and looking at them as a whole, there are 26 altogether, is that you look at Jared, who is the living embodiment of a Gap ad there, but it's not too funny because he's wearing this $75 Gap sweatshirt that he presumably found on the street. Jessica next to him is a heroin chic look. You've got Wicked here, who embodies the Marlboro Man, you know, that rugged all-male look, and you have T-Bone, who's sort of taking on the street thug look.
2 of the youths who were really instrumental to the project died, one through heroin addiction and an ultimate overdose, and the other through just a random act of violence. And then the idea of standing up and standing in memorial to these people came about through our interaction with the group as an artist, but also from the members themselves when they talked about wanting to remember these people.
And that notion of endurance really came forward on many different points. One instance I remember was when Della Rose stood, and this was in the middle of the night when there was very little activity, and there's a kind of sort of the witch's hour, 4 in the morning, And she's standing and she's trying to hold it together, and it's clear that she's dope sick, and it's clear that she's talking about some experiences and thinking about experiences that are really, really difficult.
I always thought, I'd never do prostitution, all this stuff. And then when I actually did it, it was the hardest thing. But what was scary is that it became easy and it became more normal.
And it's at that moment that she starts to buckle and faints and catches herself. And then Jackie's standing off camera talking to her during this time and saying, it's okay, just coaching folks and letting them know that what they're doing is important, and just to focus, and letting Della Rose know also that if this is all she can do, that's okay. But she was like, no, let me regain my composure, and she stood up again.
I don't know that it's actually possible to look at these things just as fine art photographs and to somehow elide or ignore the kids who are in them. I'm not saying that all art has to be political, but at the moment, simply putting pretty colors onto canvas doesn't seem to have a lot of leverage to me.
Now that this project is finished, we hope that, actually I should rephrase that, I hope that the project never becomes finished. I hope the discussion about homelessness, especially youth and homelessness, is something that this project will always raise those discussions and raise those questions and get people really talking about this issue.
For their next major project, Jacqueline Terry and Brad McCallum will be working in the District of Columbia. They will be creating a public art project with a historical bent that will look at slavery and the anti-slavery resistance in the Washington, D.C. area. For the Coffee House, I am Welmoed Laanstra.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Our guest is the author of the recently published Her Dream of Dreams, The Rise and Triumph of Madam C.J. Walker, a biography of the woman first known as Sarah Breedlove, who was born to former slaves in Mississippi 2 years after the end of the Civil War, and who, through her development of a line of hair care products for African American women, eventually became the woman known as Madam C.J. Walker, the first female self-made millionaire in the United States, as well as a nationally recognized philanthropist and entrepreneur. Our guest, Beverly Lowry, is also the author of 6 novels, including The Perfect Sonia and The Track of Real Desires, and the nonfiction classic Crossed Over, A Murder, a Memoir, based on her death row interviews with murderer Carla Faye Tucker, who was put to death by the state of Texas in 1998. Beverly Lowry also directs the graduate program in creative nonfiction at George Mason University. Welcome to the Coffee House, Beverly.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Wanted to begin by asking you what drew you to doing a biography of Madam C.J. Walker.
I was asked to write a novel about her by some people who were interested in having that done. And I got interested in her immediately. I'd never done anything like this before. I was interested also, I think, to write a biography, to write a work of historical fact, is to want to be involved in the process of doing that, which takes a lot of work in libraries, a lot of gathering of facts and information and data. And so I was intrigued by her life. I was intrigued by the process of doing this, if I could do it. I was raised in a town that was, I was a minority in the minority race. I was raised in the South. And so I've always been interested in race, and I expect I've been thinking about it since I was a small child. So that intrigued me and pulled me to sort of confront some of the things I knew and had heard and had thought about.
Mm-hmm. About race or about Madam Walker?
About race.
What in particular?
Well, I think that my life, our town, of course, was segregated when I grew up there. But it was a kind of shadow life. We were shadow lives of one another. It wasn't that they were shadows of us or the other way around. And we were always aware of one another all the time. So it was a way of taking that up at this point in my life. focusing on a particular individual and a particular time that was not my own, but through that to also sort of explore some of what I had either not explored before or not explored fully enough to satisfy me for the rest of my life. It's still, I mean, the whole thing interests me. I mean, there were many times when I thought, why am I doing this? You know, you must be crazy to do this. And probably other people thought the same thing. But I couldn't quit. I mean, I was on to something that I felt like I needed to get to the end of, or to the bottom of, to some extent.
Before this book, you had a nonfiction book, and before that, a number of novels.
Right.
And when you were onto something as a person writing biography, as a person engaged in an active history writing, was it a different sensation than being a novelist onto a character?
There were a lot of similarities because there is. I mean, when we write biography, and I think of this book as much social history as biography, but when we write about another human being, whether they are fictional or not, or have actually lived a life, we're trying to understand the heart of another. You know, I mean, and basically when it comes to people in real life, this is impossible, whether it's your mother or your child or your sister or your lover. You know, we don't know, but we get as close as we can. So in fiction, you can get as close as you need to. I mean, you're creating the person, and so you're there. You are their heart. You're in their heart. Nonfiction is different. And then Crossed Over, Carla Faye Tucker, who I wrote about in that book, she was alive, and so there was also that too. I had the living person to say to me, what about this, what about that, you know, could you leave this thing out? So it's very different. Some of the techniques are the same. The imagination, you're still trying to imagine what it was like to be that person.
Well, it seems to be one of the ways that you've tried to imagine people also, and maybe as a novelist, but it's quite notable and Crossed Over, in fact I think it's the subject, is how do we imagine someone whose life has been really different from our life, and there it's someone on death row for murder, Carla Faye Tucker.
Right.
And you find many points of connection to her, and essentially it seems to be the writer's task and the human empathetic task of the book is to find points of connection. Did you find yourself in the same process with Madame Walker?
I did, and it's not so. I mean, a friend of mine who's written a biography said she thought she sort of became that person, and I have training in the theater, and there was always a line that said, "You're not going to become Hamlet or Gertrude. You are Beverly as Gertrude," and so the same process, I think, or a similar process, is takes place in writing about a person in a nonfiction book or a piece. But I don't see how you do it otherwise. I mean, what I'm trying to find out is what it was like to be that person at that time. And so Madame Walker was not only in a different time, she was of a different race, completely different, well, a different background. Anybody who came from people who had been slaves has to have lived a different life, and who was black, and it was Reconstruction, really hard times. But this was my effort to try to get there, you know. Whether or not I succeeded, it's there.
I'm sure you've been asked, and in fact I know you have because I've seen you asked when you came to American University, how can a white woman dare write the life of a black woman? How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it's how do we dare write about the life of another? I mean, how would I dare write a book about Napoleon, or how would I dare write a book about Margaret Thatcher? You know, anybody who is not me, who is different from me, who lived in a different time from my time, there are bound to be points that somebody would say, oh, she didn't get that right. And I accept that. I mean, I accept that risk as part of the job. And I knew from the beginning that, and the same was true with Carla Faye, that there would be points when somebody would say that wasn't really what it was like to be a Hells Angel or, you know, a biker. But I came as close as I could to what seemed to me to be the truth, or seemed to me to be a possible, maybe probable idea of what happened.
Well, I think you described the act of making history as coming up with a set of probabilities.
Yeah, I think this is close to come.
Mm-hmm.
And why are there, I think the 33rd biography of Benjamin Franklin came out this year, something like that, and there are more than that of Thomas Jefferson. It's different people's take on that life as more facts become known, but not just that. It's just Walter Isaacson thought he had something to say that other people hadn't had to say. What could it be? How many new facts that could there be?
What do you feel you bring to Madame Walker that's particular to your vision?
Well, I think, first of all, I do have the vision of a novelist. I mean, it's real obvious in this book that what I want to capture is the story, and I want to capture a voice telling the story. I think Southernness probably plays a big part in there, that I feel like I really understand the countryside. But mostly what I was trying to do here was to find a person in the context of history, never separate from it, never like the story of an individual. She says, I got my start by giving myself a start. That's not what I wanted to write about, was, up from the bootstraps, here she is alone. I wanted
her idea of herself.
Yeah, that was her idea of herself. And I wanted to find her in as a part of history.
Mm-hmm. Hence the social history. It is the fabric of the book. And I should just note, I went through and noted some of the things there are histories of: the history of laundry, the history of bluing, the history of unions and strikes, the history of lynchings, the history of African American infant mortality rates, in which the book is so suspended, it seems to me.
I love that in other people's writings, when they sort of bring that much to you. One reviewer said about the wash section about laundry, it's like, please, get off the wash. He thought it went on far too long. I wouldn't have taken a word out of it. I loved it.
Well, I don't think you could take a word out of it, because you used the word mangle, and nobody even knows what a laundry mangle is anymore, let alone laundry bluing. We're almost out of time. I wonder if you could say a word about what you're working on next.
I'm doing a biography of Harriet Tubman. And there are several.
With primary research again?
What there is. I mean, there's a less even than there was about Madame Walker's early years.
Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Many thanks to Beverly Lowry for joining us in the coffee house to discuss her fascinating treatment of pioneer Madame C.J. Walker. I'm Richard McCann, and this has been Writer's Block.
I want fairy tale. Yes, Prince Charming, behind the wheel of a '65 black ragtop Mustang. Falcon, Fairlane, '64 Dodge Dart with red interior. No, a push-button Plymouth. Yeah, I want Prince Charming charging up the road behind the wheel of a baby blue push-button Valiant with room for two and an ice chest, tool chest, gas can, jumper cables. Fairy tale or not, it is a '62. To break down in small towns, Oceanside, Route 1, West Coast, Redwood, fog-strewn, Mojave Desert, dry riverbed. I want to set something on fire. I want fairy tale, hot sex, love, and laughter, and man, I need some laughs. A pair of good hands, strong arms to fold into, strength of character, and kind eyes. Yeah, I know. I want fairy tale. For him to arrive like magic when I don't feel quite like Toad, when I've brushed and flossed my teeth, showered, maybe have shaved my legs, have washed my face of the night before like magic. When my head and direction both are clear, and my emotions aren't so easily swayed, when for once in the last decade my defenses are finally down. Oh yeah, fairy tale. Love at first sight? Maybe from a year or so ago, when nervous tics and foibles, which you might have overlooked or found quite charming at first, have given advance warning, and not to be annoyed, and to love him anyway. I want to be unsoiled and still forgiving, not to be so easily cracked when brittle or quickly faded with time, to have a lover that understands how easy it is to lose your mind in knowing that there is no happily ever after, but for it to be fine to want it anyway. I want no more wanting. Yeah, I know. I want fairy tale. Oh, don't worry about me. These strength and bones and birth and hips, a belly cradled within that holds a closed womb that will never hold child again. Oh, no sympathetic eyes or pitiful violins, and please, no bleeding hearts for me. No victim. Find the heart beating passionate under breast, paced with anger, or rabbit kicking like, first kiss. Look into the face of this one. Touch these scars that mark out time. Read their history of a life lived yet somehow still unfulfilled. These scars that scream and mourn, that attend flesh. Sink into these eyes, not your culturally diversified almond-shaped cliche and not your watery pools of blue, but Indian, brown, and brimmed red, with your anger, worn out, shot down, excited, brightly pocked, pained, and sorrowed, but not your almond, not your victim.
Rave dance parties. The message kids often get from grown-ups is, raves equal drugs equals death. Are raves nothing but a haven for suicidal druggies? Or is there something more to the scene that attracts young people by the thousands? Is it the art? The lighting? The dancing? The music? The top electronic dance music magazine in America raves about the DC club scene, which attracts superstar DJs like Diesel Boy and Sandra Collins.
I love playing in DC. The crowd here, I get along with great, and I usually end up staying for a couple days after, hanging out with people I just met that night.
I think DC has among the best DJs in the country. We have a reputation for very high standards, very high skill level, and we have a very friendly, open scene so that new DJs do get plenty of opportunity to play. As in other cities I've heard, you just don't get opportunities if you don't know somebody or you're not part of the Old Boy network. Sure, the network is here and you have to be friends with so-and-so, but it's much more open, I think, relatively than other countries and other cities in the States. So yeah, we have a very high caliber of DJs. Certain genres get along better here than others, like house is really big here. So house DJs come and succeed and stay, whereas techno DJs, techno is not popular here, so they come and then they leave, or they grow up here and then they find other cities that are more techno-friendly to play in.
DJ Zelda has been spinning for 5 years. She launched the first DJ school in America.
It takes a lot of fine motor control. It takes a lot of training your ear to hear different sounds and to be able to distinguish, because yeah, it's a lot of electronic sounds all on top of each other. Especially within one record, there's a lot of sounds. Within 2 records, that's double the amount of sounds. Trying to sort those out, get the records going the exact same speed, and place them well on top of each other so that there's a synergy going on.
This isn't your father's or your mother's turntable. DJs today don't just spin discs. They sample and mix multiple audio sources, creating a new and unique sound. Computers are now central to the dance music scene, and VJs, video jockeys, play an ever more central role in orchestrating the multimedia experience.
VJing is not something that it's not something standard like DJing. VJing is, since it's kind of young and new art, you can go from having tapes and just playing them back to having specialized computer programs to mix clips in the computer with, or some people work with feedback, just pointing the camera at a screen and manipulating the feedback that comes out of the screen. There's all sorts of different things that you can do.
And lots of ways to do it. Ask rave artist Era Lachlan.
I like work with plastics, mostly marble. It depends what I can acquire. Work with steel, marble, wood, polyester resin. So anything that it's usable. That I can incorporate into 3-dimension.
But the outsider reaction to raves is often one-dimensional, hostile. Lonnie Fisher has thrown large events in the D.C.-Baltimore area for over 10 years. It's not always been easy, like in the summer of 1996.
The last boat party got shut down and raided by the police and the Coast Guard due to an ongoing struggle between my company and the police in the Baltimore area. Basically, there were certain officers who didn't want my company doing events, but they had no legal means to stop us from doing so, so they attempted to frame me for being a drug dealer, which eventually led to me meeting with the mayor of Baltimore, who completely realized that the charges were bogus and reinstated our ability to do events in the city.
But in 1999, DC's Fox 5 TV did a hidden camera expose on the rave scene, a techno event, Buzz.
In the 2 days since our story aired exposing drug use and police officers who appear to ignore it, Police Chief Charles Ramsey has called for an internal investigation. He's also suspended or reassigned some officers, and city leaders are calling for new anti-drug legislation.
Use of ecstasy can result in death, coma, unconsciousness, or brain damage.
The report frightened some viewers, but it galvanized the rave community in D.C., including a rave elder.
After the segment on Fox 5 ran and Buzz got shut down, it was like I had lost my home. It was so devastating to the scene. You know, we didn't take it lightly. Within the scene, we were saying, we got to do something. We can't just let this happen. And so the energy grew, and somebody called for a rally. Let's have a rally in front of Fox 5.
Outside Channel 5 studios, a protest, a peaceful protest. They say the rave scene was not portrayed accurately. It's not about drugs. Instead, they say it's all about the music.
Somebody had the idea that we should all wear yellow to protest yellow journalism, but we would make it, happy and fun, and let them know that we're good people. We deserve to have a place to dance. It was a great, tremendous victory for us.
Rave goers may have won that skirmish, but drug warriors are arming for the next battle. The proposed Methamphetamines Act, for example, aims to jail those it deems, quote, promoters of drug entertainment, people who reasonably ought to know about the presence of drugs at events they sponsor.
I don't understand reasonably ought to know means, and so that really scares me that this is something that we could fall under. And since they are targeting promoters, that Buzz or somebody from Buzz would wind up getting 9 years in a federal prison. And I don't know how we could prevent it any more so than we already are.
Back at the time of the Fox 5 report, there was no group like RPM.
This. So it has this same thing. That's why ecstasy is actually a bit of a longer high.
RPM is the Baltimore and DC Dance Safe chapter. Dance Safe is a national organization, and there's chapters throughout the country, and our goal is to promote the health and safety of the rave and nightclub community. And our chapter has been in existence, it'll be 2 years in September. And we set up booths at raves and nightclubs throughout D.C. and the Baltimore area, and we give out information using a harm reduction perspective on drug use, safer sex, healthy lifestyles, and we also give out a lot of materials like condoms and lube and dental dams and earplugs and a lot of different information that can relate to partygoers and how they can help keep themselves safe and healthy.
The saying goes, truth is the first victim of war. So it is with the war on drugs, which equates raves with drugs, with death. Never mind that in the year 2000, there was just one death from so-called club drugs in D.C., according to the Drug Abuse Warning Network. For the Coffee House, I'm Dagmar Micah.
Happy birthday, here I go thinking about you again. Haven't seen you on your birthday since I don't know when. Happy birthday, my dear old friend. So much has happened since we rounded that bend. And here's to your birthday today. I'll always remember you on this day. Happy birthday to you. Don't think I'll ever get over what we've been through. Happy birthday, honey, this is your special day. And I've got nothing but happiness to send your way. So here's to your birthday today. I'll always remember you on this day. Just another spin around the sun without you. Just another turn around the seasons. Just another day I can't forget about you. I light another candle for you. Happy birthday, may all your wishes come true. Nobody could wish you more love than I do. Happy birthday, there is nothing I wouldn't do. If I could spend just one birthday more right there with you. So here's to your birthday today. I'll always remember you on this day. And here's to your birthday today. I'll always remember you on this. Just another spin around the sun without you. Just another turn around the seasons. Just another day I can't forget about you. I light another candle for you.
Wow, that was wonderful. I'd like to welcome you to the musical traditions segment of the Coffee House.
Thank you.
I think the very first time I heard you play, you played that song.
That's right.
Yeah. It had quite an impact on everybody, I remember.
Mm.
It's, how long ago did you write that?
I wrote that about 4 years ago. It was actually the reason that I made my CD in the first place. I was making a collection of songs for a friend for a birthday present. So that was kind of the centerpiece of the album.
It's a great song.
Thank you.
It's a great song. I heard a rumor or something that the Washington Post has given you a little accolade recently. I think
Maria Villafana of the Washington Post, the MP3 site that they have, WashingtonPost.com, chose us as one of the top 10 favorites of the year.
So now we can segue, because you say us, and you're playing solo, so
That's right.
maybe there's a couple other people here.
Yes.
And we'll call them up and do a little trio action.
Sure, yeah. Brad Allen is my guitar player and
Okay.
co-writer and producer, and Willard Morris is my violin player.
Okay, and what are you going to take us out with?
We are going to do a song called Within Your Fire.
Okay, all right, light them up. Thanks.
Nothing in your hand, a rose between your teeth, the world at your command, and you underneath, just lying there within a grain of sand. Flowers in your hair, a flute between your lips. It seems that you don't care from here in my abyss, but I feel you like a stranger's prayer, rising from the ash, ashes from the flame, ashes from the flame of you, rising from the ash, ashes from the flame of you. I am within your fire. Everywhere you face, and a myriad of names, then you're gone without a trace in your clever lover's games. My eyes veiled by your embrace, shadowed by your light, and blazoned by the black, atoned but not contrite, I enter through the back, and I see you in the dead of night, rising from the ash, ashes from the flame, ashes from the flame of you. I am within your fire, light to light and skin to skin, heart to heart and sin to sin, mind to mind and eye to eye, earth to earth and sky to sky, hand to hand and mouth to mouth, ache to ache and doubt to doubt, one to one, two to two, fire to fire and me to you. Every step a dance, every spoken word a song. Life is a romance, and I am swept along in your beauty. Light to light and skin to skin, heart to heart and doubt and soul to kiss. Run to you in lock and key. Fire consuming you and me.